Chapter 1. The shadow at the harvest ferret was the sort of September afternoon that Lower Brambleton excelled at producing. Golden sunlight scattered through the gaps in the hedgerows, the scent of baked apples drifting from the Women's Guild tent, and a mellow contentment humming through the villagers as they wandered among the stalls of the annual harvest fair. Miss Marple, wearing her best straw hat with the faded cornflower ribbon, stood admiring the displays of marrows and cabbages, arrayed like military ranks across the village green. She carried a modest basket, though she had little need for more jam or chutney, and conversed amiably with old friends, careful to listen as much as she spoke. It was not simply the produce or the hand-knitted scarves that drew her interest. It was people. Lower Brambleton was a village much like her own St. Mary Mead, small enough to foster familiarity, large enough to hide resentments in neatly trimmed hedges. And today Miss Marple could feel it, the slight current beneath the merriment, like the river's pull beneath a mill-pond surface. Something was not quite right. It was during the cake, judging that the first hint of trouble arrived. Young Tommy Wills, sent by his mother to fetch elderberry cordial from the vicarage kitchen, came running back pale and breathless. "There's a body," he shouted, pointing back toward the churchyard. The murmured laughter that had accompanied the fair froze instantly. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Reverend Greenway, startled and adjusting his spectacles, hurried towards the boy. "Where? Lad, what on earth are you saying?" "In the yew tree, by the big old one near the vestry wall. Someone's there, lying still." Within minutes, a small crowd formed. Inspector Cray, who had come up from Milchester to judge the chutneys, and had been cornered into helping with the coconut shy, took immediate charge. "No one crowd the area," he barked, pushing back the curious villagers. "Let me through." Miss Marple, calm as ever, set her basket discreetly by the tea-tent, and followed at a measured pace, keeping to the fringes. The yew tree in question was a gnarled and ancient thing older than the church itself, its dark branches twisted like clutching fingers. Children had dared each other for generations to climb its thick lower limbs or to whisper ghost stories beneath its heavy boughs. But today it was no child's game. Beneath the yew's heavy shadow, half concealed by roots and ivy, lay a figure, a woman, motionless. Miss Marple noted several things immediately. The neat shoes, the sensible coat, the gloved hands folded awkwardly across the chest, as if arranged. It was Miss Beatrice Hartnell, the church organist. There was no blood, no visible sign of violence, just a stillness that was entirely at odds with the golden afternoon and the happy chatter a few yards away. "She's gone," Inspector Cray said a moment later, straightening from his brief examination. His face was grim. "Fetch Dr. Larch immediately, and keep people back." The crowd began to murmur. Beatrice Hartnell, dead on Harvest Fair Day, under the ancient yew. Whispers flew like startled sparrows. She was as healthy as a horse. Fainted, surely. No sign of struggle. Poor soul. Organ practice every Thursday. Never missed a service. Miss Marple said nothing. Her sharp blue eyes took in not just the scene before her, but the reactions around her. Mrs. Pembroke's hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Greeley, the churchwarden, looking decidedly green. The vicar's wife, clutching the Harvest Festival flower arrangements to her chest as if they might shield her. Miss Marple knew one thing above all. In a village such as Lower Brambleton, nothing happened without reason. And Beatrice Hartnell's death, however peaceful it might seem, was no accident of nature. The afternoon unravelled swiftly. The harvest fair was abandoned. Stalls were shuttered, cakes forgotten, bunting left to flap in the sudden sharp wind. Inspector Cray, efficient if not imaginative, began taking down names, accounts of who had seen Miss Hartnell last, when she had been noticed missing from the fair, who had been near the churchyard. "She was called away," said Mrs. Canfield, lowering her voice. "Someone sent word, a message from the vicar perhaps. That's what I heard." "More likely from the churchwarden," muttered Mr. Tulliver, the cobbler. "There was always talk between them." Miss Marple tucked away these comments carefully. Already she saw the shape of things to come, the whisper of secrets, the murmuring of scandal, the slow, inevitable surfacing of old wrongs. That evening, back in her guest room at the Rose and Crown Inn, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, sipping weak tea and reflecting. She had observed Beatrice Hartnell in the days leading up to the Harvest Fair, at choir practice, at Sunday service, at the Women's Guild meeting, where the order of the Harvest Festival had been hotly debated, and she had seen, if not overt hostility, then certainly tension. Small glances exchanged, sudden silences when Miss Hartnell entered the room. Something had been brewing beneath the placid smiles and polite nods, and now it had erupted, without fanfare, without violence, a death under the yew. Symbolic, ancient, not deliberate? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and smiled a little sadly. She would not need to search for the truth. It was already beginning to leak out, through the gossip of the tea-room, the tremble of a gloved hand, the nervous laughter of those who insisted it must have been natural causes after all. The truth was in the behaviour, and human nature, Miss Marple knew, rarely concealed itself for long, especially in a village, especially under the shadow of a churchyard yew. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the next morning, the shock of Beatrice Hartnell's death had woven itself into the very air of Lower Brambleton. At the post office, Mrs. Biddle exchanged theories in hushed tones over brown paper parcels. The greengrocer's Mrs. Canfield abandoned all pretence of selecting apples, and instead leaned against the bins, relaying second-hand information with feverish glee. Even the vicarage itself buzzed with nervous visits and half-hearted offers of help, thin excuses to learn anything new. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the Golden Gables tea-room, her knitting needles clacking gently, listened. One did not need to solicit gossip in a village. One merely needed to wait. "I tell you, she must have had a weak heart," declared Mrs. Pennington, the butcher's wife, stabbing a jam tart with her fork. "She looked pale last Sunday, didn't she, Alice?" "Pale?" sniffed Alice Hargraves, the schoolmistress. "She was positively flushed. It was the argument with Mrs. Tulliver over the harvest hymn. I was there, you know." "What argument?" Mrs. Biddle demanded, leaning forward eagerly. "Oh, it was dreadful," Alice said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Mrs. Tulliver wanted to replace "Come, ye thankful people. Come with some modern nonsense." Beatrice put her foot down, said it was improper, that tradition must be upheld. They had words, sharp ones. Miss Marple noted the glances exchanged over teacups. Conflict at the Women's Guild was as dangerous as arsenic in the preserves. From the adjacent table, Miss Finch contributed her own morsel. I heard she was seen speaking with Mr. Greeley, the churchwarden, behind the vestry, till the morning of the fair, looking rather distressed too. Mrs. Canfield leaned closer. They were always rather close, weren't they? Beatrice and Mr. Greeley? A titter of scandal rippled across the table. Miss Marple made a neat pearl stitch. Perhaps it was financial, Mrs. Biddle mused aloud. I mean, Beatrice was never wealthy. Maybe there was a loan, or a bequest from the parish funds, or something worse, whispered Mrs. Pennington with relish. Mrs. Hargraves gasped. Surely you don't mean embezzlement? No one dared say it aloud, but the silence was damning. The most curious contribution came from young Tommy Wills himself, who had returned to the fairground that morning to help dismantle the abandoned stalls. She had a paper in her hand. He told the vicar's wife, who then hurried to share the news with the tea-room crowd. When I found her, looked like a letter, but when I ran back with the others, it was gone. A letter? Mrs. Canfield exclaimed. Gone? Yes, said Tommy firmly. Maybe the wind blew it away, or someone took it. The possibilities were too delicious for the assembled ladies to resist. Miss Marple, however, frowned very slightly. Children could often be mistaken, but Tommy Wills was a careful boy, known for his storytelling only when it concerned crickets and marbles, not corpses. If he said there had been a letter, there very likely had been, and someone had made very sure it vanished. Later that day, as clouds rolled heavy across the autumn sky, Miss Marple walked the short distance to the churchyard. The harvest fair detritus had been cleared, but the grass still showed trampling footsteps. She paused before the great yew tree, its dark limbs clawing the sky. There was no sign now of the scene that had so shocked the village. Only a faint depression in the grass where Beatrice's body had lain. Miss Marple bent carefully at the waist, inspecting the roots around the base of the tree. She found, tucked beneath a cluster of ivy, the glint of something white. Carefully, she drew it out. It was a torn scrap of thick, expensive paper, half of what might have once been a folded letter. The ink was badly smudged by rain, but a few words remained legible. Cannot be allowed to continue. The consequences will... Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her reticule. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in her experience, murders, or even suspicious deaths, were built not on grand clues, but on the tiny, overlooked things that others dismissed. That evening, Inspector Cray called an informal meeting at the vicarage for those most closely associated with the church. Miss Marple, invited more out of courtesy than necessity, or so Cray no doubt believed, sat quietly by the fire as the others arrived. Mr. Greeley, the churchwarden, arrived first, hat in hand, looking haggard. Mrs. Tulliver, of the Women's Guild, bustled in after him, red-faced and defensive. Reverend Greenway, naturally, presided, clearly uncomfortable at having his parishioners questioned, under his own roof. Cray began with gentle inquiries. When each had last seen Miss Hartnell, whether she had mentioned any troubles, whether anyone had observed anything odd at the fair. The answers were predictably vague. She was distracted lately, Mr. Greeley admitted, twisting his hat between his fingers. Snappish, not like herself. She worried too much about the organ repairs, Mrs. Tulliver sniffed, as if a little rust were the end of the world. She said, Reverend Greenway said slowly, that she had reason to believe someone was misusing church funds. There was a sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Did she say whom she suspected? Nitty asked. The vicar shook his head. Only that she had proof. She said she intended to bring it to me. That was 2 days ago. And now, said Cray grimly, no proof, no letter, no evidence. A heavy silence settled over the room. It was broken only by the sharp snap of Mrs. Tulliver's knitting needles. After the meeting broke up, Cray approached Miss Marple as she prepared to leave. I don't suppose, he said, that you noticed anything that might help? Miss Marple smiled gently. I have noticed, Inspector, that in small villages money is seldom misappropriated by strangers. Nor, in my experience, do secrets remain secret very long when greed is involved. Cray frowned. Meaning? Meaning, said Miss Marple softly, that if Miss Hartnell threatened to expose someone, and that someone acted to silence her, we are not dealing with cunning, but with desperation. She stepped out into the cool night air. The stars overhead were dim, veiled by scudding clouds. A storm was coming, and with it the truth. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The day after the gathering at the vicarage dawned grey and unsettled, a brisk wind stirring the golden leaves into restless eddies along Lower Brambleton's cobbled lanes. Miss Marple, finishing her morning cup of tea, felt the familiar tingling sensation that often preceded her inquiries. That combination of curiosity, intuition, and an acute sense that human nature, left to its own devices, would soon betray itself. She slipped on her sensible shoes and set out along the village lanes. It was not her method to barge in with accusations or demands. No, Miss Marple preferred a gentler course, to stitch herself into the daily fabric of village life, so that when a thread pulled loose, she could see exactly where the garment frayed. Her first stop was the church vestry, under the benign pretense of assisting with the rearrangement of hymnals for the coming Harvest Sunday service. Mr. Greeley, the churchwarden, was already there, wrestling with a dusty crate of Bibles. "My dear Miss Marple," he exclaimed, straightening up, face flushed from exertion. "Come to lend a hand, have you? I thought it might be therapeutic," Miss Marple said mildly. "Physical labour has always been my remedy for troubled minds." He chuckled awkwardly. "We could all use that, I think." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Miss Marple said quite casually, "Poor Miss Hartnell, such a sudden loss, and with the harvest festival so close too." Greeley nodded heavily. She would have wanted it all to continue. She believed in duty, even more than most. Such a devoted servant of the church, Miss Marple mused. Tell me, was she also involved with parish finances? Greeley hesitated. Only peripherally, he said. Fundraising committees, organ maintenance appeals, things of that sort, but no. The primary accounts are overseen by the parish council. I'm treasurer, you know." "Of course you are," said Miss Marple warmly. "It must be a heavy responsibility," smiled tightly. "One does one's best." She noted the faint sheen of perspiration at his temples, though the vestry was cool, and then, as if driven by an inner compulsion, Greeley added, "Beatrice was meticulous. Sometimes too much so. She had a knack for seeing things others would prefer left unseen." Miss Marple merely nodded, filing the remark carefully away. Later that morning, she stopped by the general store, ostensibly for a spool of darning thread. Mrs. Tulliver was there, haggling with Mr. Sims over the price of candied ginger, her voice rising with shrill indignation. Miss Marple waited patiently, examining a display of homemade marmalades, until Mrs. Tulliver finished and turned toward the door. "Oh, Mrs. Tulliver," Miss Marple called, smiling sweetly, "might I trouble you for a moment? I was wondering about the Harvest Festival decorations. I understand you had quite a spirited debate with Miss Hartnell regarding the hymn selection." Mrs. Tulliver flushed a deep beetroot. "Spirited, indeed. She was stubborn as a mule, Miss Marple. Wouldn't hear of anything new. I only suggested one contemporary hymn. One, and she acted as though I'd proposed dancing girls and fiddlers in the nave." She huffed, adjusting her string bag. "Tradition's all very well, but sometimes one must move with the times. Beatrice didn't see that. She must have been under a great deal of strain," Miss Marple said gently. "I imagine overseeing both music and finances would be a tremendous burden." Mrs. Tulliver's eyes darted sideways. "Well," she said grudgingly, "she did fuss about the accounts now and again, claimed she'd found irregularities, but it was all nonsense, I'm sure. Sour grapes, perhaps." "Sour grapes?" Mrs. Tulliver's lips thinned. "Well, it's no secret Beatrice wanted to be on the parish council herself, but no one supported her. Not even the vicar. She never forgave that." "Ah," said Miss Marple, her voice soft as butter. "Ambitions thwarted." She let the thought dangle like bait on a line. Mrs. Tulliver, to Miss Marple's satisfaction, bit. She was proud, the woman sniffed. Proud and lonely. She lived in that dreadful little cottage with no family, no prospects. Only the church to give her any standing at all. Miss Marple watched the woman bustle away, her cheeks still flushed with resentment. Lonely, proud, desperate. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Rose and Crown, where Reverend Greenway had arranged to meet her for tea. It was a private setting, away from the ears of gossiping villagers. He arrived precisely on time, looking weary but determined. "I hope you'll forgive my presumption," he said after they'd ordered, "but I trust your instincts, Miss Marple. They've served Milchester parishioners more than once." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "I merely observe, Reverend. Nature does the rest." He smiled faintly. Nature or human nature? After a moment's silence, he leaned forward. "I didn't tell Inspector Cray everything the other night." "Oh? I was afraid it would seem like slander. But Beatrice confided in me recently. She had discovered something. Something she said threatened the very reputation of the parish council." Miss Marple said nothing, encouraging him to continue. She didn't name names, but she hinted that someone was diverting funds meant for the Harvest Festival repair appeals. Money that should have gone to the church roof, the organ restoration. Miss Marple steepled her fingers. "And Did she say how she had discovered this? She mentioned briefly that it was in the accounts, that she had seen altered figures. She said she intended to reveal it after the fair, before or after the fair's conclusion. He hesitated. After. She wanted to preserve the spirit of the festival. She said she owed it to the congregation. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Then someone else owed her something rather different, she said quietly. By the time twilight draped the village in mist once more, Miss Marple had stitched together enough of the pattern to glimpse its broader form. Someone had stolen from the church. Someone had feared exposure. And someone, perhaps more than one, had decided that a harvest festival free from scandal was worth far more than a single inconvenient life. But Miss Marple also knew that human folly often ran deeper than mere greed. No, there was something else here. A second thread twined around the first pride. Loneliness, old betrayals, half forgotten, but never truly forgiven. And somewhere among them, the truth, waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. Tomorrow, she thought, it would be time to look more closely at the past of Lower Brambleton, at the long-standing grievances, debts unpaid, and friendships that had curdled into resentments. Because Beatrice Hartnell had not merely been killed to protect money, she had been killed to protect memory. And memories, as Miss Marple well knew, were the most dangerous things of all. Chapter 4. First Suspects. Inspector Cray was not, by Miss Marple's estimation, an unintelligent man. He was, however, a man inclined to favour the obvious solution, a habit Miss Marple had often observed among officials who must contend with limited time, limited patience, and abundant paperwork. Thus, it came as no surprise when, by the next morning, 2 names began circulating with increasing fervour: Mr. Greeley, the churchwarden, and Mrs. Tulliver of the Women's Guild. Both had quarrelled publicly with Miss Hartnell. Both had proximity to the church accounts, and both, it was whispered behind gloved hands and across counters stacked with scones, had something to lose. Inspector Cray convened an official interview at the village hall, a solemn affair complete with a clipboard, a borrowed typewriter, and Sergeant Webb from Milchester taking notes with grave efficiency. Miss Marple, ostensibly there to assist with tea service, was given a seat at the back. Her knitting needles clicked quietly as she watched. First came Mr. Greeley. He shuffled into the room, hat clutched to his chest, looking as if he expected to be hanged before lunchtime. "Now then, Mr. Greeley," Cray began, in what he likely believed was a reassuring tone, "we just want to clarify a few things. You were seen speaking privately with Miss Hartnell on the morning of the fair?" "Yes, sir. Only about the harvest decorations," Greeley said, voice trembling. "She was concerned the bunting wasn't secured properly to the vestry wall. Health and safety, you know." "Nothing about church funds?" "No, sir." Greeley wiped his brow. "Nothing of the sort. I'd never touch a penny." Cray leaned forward. "And yet it's known that you've been struggling financially since the roof repairs at your cottage." Greeley flushed deep. "Red, that's true," he admitted, "but I wouldn't stoop to theft. The church is sacred to me, Inspector." Cray made a non-committal grunt. Miss Marple, observing keenly, noticed something else. Guilt, yes, but of the personal variety. Shame over private failings, perhaps. Not necessarily the guilt of a murderer. Next came Mrs. Tulliver. She swept into the hall in her best coat, chin high, lips pursed into a formidable line. Cray wasted no time. You and Miss Hartnell were known to have clashed over church matters. Indeed, Mrs. Tulliver said crisply, and I am not ashamed to say so. Beatrice Hartnell was a tyrant. She treated the Women's Guild as her personal fiefdom. You argued over hymn selections. Among other things, she said, folding her gloved hands primly. But I hardly see how disliking her ideas translates into murder, Inspector. Cray eyed her narrowly. You also have access to the church accounts. Mrs. Tulliver sniffed. As secretary to the Flower Committee, I sign requisition forms for lilies and chrysanthemums, not for embezzling vast sums. Did Miss Hartnell ever accuse you directly? She hinted. Mrs. Tulliver admitted stiffly. That's what she did best, hints and insinuations, but she never had the courage to confront anyone openly. And where were you at the time of the fair when Miss Hartnell's body was discovered? Mrs. Tulliver bristled. Helping Mrs. Canfield set up the cake stall, as a dozen witnesses can confirm. I did not sneak away to poison the organist. No one said anything about poisoning, Cray said sharply. Mrs. Tulliver coloured, but said nothing more. Miss Marple, finishing a neat row of stitches, made another mental note. Guilt here too, but not the guilt of a killer. Rather, the guilt of someone who had wished harm, perhaps spoken of it in unguarded anger, and now feared being blamed for its actualization. A very human fear. But not, she suspected, the hand behind Beatrice Hartnell's death. After the interviews, Inspector Cray rubbed his temples. Well, what do you make of it, Miss Marple? He asked as she refilled his teacup. She smiled gently. Both Mr. Greeley and Mrs. Tulliver had reasons to resent Miss Hartnell. Both had opportunity, certainly. And motive? Ah, said Miss Marple. There you touch the heart of the matter, Inspector. Motive is a tricky thing. It is seldom pure. Resentment can simmer for years without leading to violence. Pride can fester. But fear, Inspector, fear acts swiftly. Cray frowned. You think someone was afraid of exposure? I think so, she said, but perhaps not for the reasons we first assumed. He grunted. Well, for now, there are strongest leads. Of course, Miss Marple agreed politely, her needles clicking once more. She would not interfere, not yet, but she had seen another pattern emerging. One woven not merely from recent disputes, but from older loyalties and older betrayals, the kind of things villages forgot in words, but not in hearts. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk toward the old rectory, a crumbling stone building now abandoned for several years since Reverend Pritchard's passing. Children whispered that it was haunted. Miss Marple knew better. The real ghosts in a village did not rattle chains. They lived in the memories of its people, and the old rectory had played a role once, long ago, during a parish scandal so discreetly buried that only the oldest villagers still remembered. Miss Marple had overheard enough during her visits to suspect that Beatrice Hartnell had stumbled not merely over misappropriated funds, but over something deeper, something tied to the rectory, to lost promises, and to the ancient church itself. As she passed the lich gate, she paused to study the churchyard once again. The yew tree stood dark and stoic against the slate sky. At its roots, invisible now to the casual eye, had been the ending of Beatrice Hartnell's life. But the yew had seen much before this. Pacts, confessions broken, vows. And now, perhaps, one more betrayal, written not in stone or parchment, but in silence and fear and quiet death. Miss Marple tucked her scarf closer around her throat and continued her walk. She would need to tread carefully now. The killer, whoever they were, would not strike again. But the village itself might turn against anyone who stirred too deep, and Miss Marple, with her gentle questions and sharp eyes, intended to stir as deep as needed. Because Beatrice Hartnell's death was not an accident. It was a consequence. And consequences, as she well knew, could not be buried forever. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned once more to the churchyard. The villagers, cowed by the inspector's warnings, kept a respectful distance now, and even the curious children were nowhere in sight. The crows circled lazily overhead, their cries sharp against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple moved slowly across the uneven ground, her gloved hands folded behind her back, her pale blue eyes missing nothing. The yew tree's shadow stretched long and dark toward the lich gate. Beneath its boughs, the grass was flattened where the crowd had gathered after Tommy Wills's cry. Miss Marple picked her way carefully around the tree, pausing where the ivy was thickest. There, wedged between two knotted roots, she found it. A button, small, pearl grey, with a faint chip on its edge. Not unusual in itself. But when she bent closer, she saw the button was attached to a torn fragment of dark green cloth, snagged on a protruding root. It was no larger than a postage stamp, but it was enough. Miss Marple slipped it into her reticule, her mind already turning. None of the garments worn by Mr. Greeley or Mrs. Tulliver at the harvest fair had been dark green, nor had Beatrice Hartnell's simple navy coat. But someone else had worn green. She had noticed it without thinking at the time, merely a passing observation. But now it sang out in her mind like a struck bell. At the Golden Gables tea-room, Mrs. Biddle and Mrs. Canfield were deep in conversation over their third pots of tea. Miss Marple took her customary seat near the window, ordering a simple buttered scone she had no real intention of eating. From their gossip, she learned nothing new, only the increasingly baroque theories about Beatrice's death, now involving poison pen letters, secret love affairs, and even at one point a gypsy curse. No, the truth would not be found in rumour. It would be found in detail. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the coat rack near the door, and there it was, a familiar dark green tweed coat, the hem dusty with soil. Not Mrs. Tulliver's, not Mr. Greeley's. Mrs. Harriet Blake's. Harriet Blake, widow of the late Dr. Jonathan Blake, former village physician, respected if a little aloof. Harriet had long been one of the quieter figures in Lower Brambleton, always present at parish events but seldom at the centre of anything. She had attended the harvest fair, Miss Marple recalled distinctly, helping at the preserves stall, and she had been wearing that coat, a coat with small pearl grey buttons. That evening, Miss Marple took tea with her host at the Rose and Crown, Mr. Alistair Hodge, the retired schoolmaster who had run the village school for 3 decades before settling into a life of gentle complaints and even gentler gossip. Over scones and seed cake, she broached the subject. "Tell me, Mr. Hodge," she said lightly, "what do you make of dear Mrs. Blake?" He arched an eyebrow. "A good woman, if a bit withdrawn," he said thoughtfully. "Still lives in that big house at the end of Willow Lane. Must be lonely for her, rattling around in all those empty rooms." "No family nearby?" "None. No children, you see. Her husband passed on 5 years ago now. A great loss, Doctor. Blake was much admired. And Mrs. Blake herself?" Miss Marple prompted. Hodge shrugged. "She's well liked enough. Devoted to the church, you know. Ran the parish charity committee for years. Gave it up just before Beatrice took it over." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "She gave it up?" Hodge nodded. "Oh, yes. Some disagreement about the accounts, I believe. Whispered about at the time, but nothing was ever made official. You know how it is. Paperwork goes missing. Numbers don't add up." He chuckled dryly. "Beatrice insisted on an audit. Old Harriet stepped down very quietly after that." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. But inside, her mind raced. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Willow Lane. The Blake house sat back from the road, shielded by tall hedges and a low stone wall. The garden was well kept, but a little too tidy, as though maintained more from duty than love. Harriet Blake answered the door herself, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call." "I thought perhaps you might appreciate some company," Miss Marple said gently. "I know how unsettling all this must be." Harriet hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, please, come in." The sitting-room was neat to the point of sterility. No books left open on tables, no newspapers strewn across armchairs. Only order and silence. Miss Marple accepted a cup of weak tea and a plate of dry biscuits, and after the necessary pleasantries, she set her bait. "You must miss the parish charity work," she said conversationally. "Such a rewarding effort." Harriet's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "I had to step back," she said. "Too many complications." "Complications!" Harriet looked at her sharply, then down into her lap. "I suppose there's no harm in admitting it now. There were questions about the funds, misplaced donations." Harriet's mouth tightened. Beatrice made quite a fuss. She was right, of course. I lost track of some payments. I never took a penny for myself, but it looked bad, very bad. I imagine it was difficult to bear," Miss Marple said kindly. Harriet gave a brittle laugh. She didn't mean to be cruel, but she could be relentless. Once Beatrice decided something needed fixing, she wouldn't stop until it was. "You feared she might raise those old matters again?" Miss Marple asked gently. Harriet's face went still. "She told me at the fair that she intended to clear the books after the festival, that she wanted everything put to rights before the new budget meeting." "And you knew what that meant?" Harriet closed her eyes. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "I swear I didn't. I spoke sharply to her, yes, but when I heard she had died, I was relieved, horribly, horribly relieved." Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. I believe you, she said. Relief is a terrible thing when it follows death. But it is not the same as murder. Harriet's shoulders sagged. But someone else, Miss Marple said softly. Someone else feared far more than mere embarrassment. Someone who feared ruin. That afternoon, Miss Marple met with Inspector Cray again at the parish hall. She handed him the button and cloth fragment. "There's your first real clue, Inspector," she said quietly, "and it points not to resentment, but to fear. Not of Beatrice Hartnell herself, but of what she knew and intended to reveal." Cray turned the button over in his thick fingers, frowning. "And you believe Mrs. Blake?" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "She had motive, but not the necessary courage." "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes, very blue and very sharp, fixed on his. "That," she said, "is what we are about to find out." Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Inspector Cray, armed with Miss Marple's discovery of the cloth fragment and a newfound resolve, decided it was time for more pointed conversations. "Secrets," he muttered to Sergeant Webb as they prepared for another round of interviews, always rot from the inside. Miss Marple, meanwhile, set about her own quieter method, allowing secrets to ripen until they dropped one by one into her lap. She began with Mrs. Tulliver. The Women's Guild was gathering that afternoon to reorganize the Harvest Festival. Flowers, a task which had turned grim in the wake of Miss Hartnell's death. Bouquets that should have adorned the altar now sat half-wilted in the vestry, the scent of lilies heavy and oppressive. Mrs. Tulliver was arranging chrysanthemums with aggressive precision when Miss Marple approached. "My dear," said Miss Marple, her voice bright, "have you a moment? I've a terrible eye for symmetry. I wonder if you might advise me." Flattered, Mrs. Tulliver abandoned her task to peer critically at Miss Marple's haphazard bundle. "Under the guise of floral arrangement," Miss Marple said softly. "It's terrible to think how death reveals things we'd much rather forget." Mrs. Tulliver stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, just that even old disagreements can seem sharper in hindsight," Miss Marple said airily. "Take you and dear Beatrice. Such different visions for the parish work." Mrs. Tulliver's lips tightened. "She wanted control over everything," she snapped. "Even the Guild's funds." Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet it was not the Guild's accounts Beatrice spoke of exposing. "Mrs. Tulliver faltered. What do you mean?" Miss Marple arranged a sprig of baby's breath, watching her closely. "She spoke of broader matters, Mrs. Tulliver. Matters reaching beyond hymns and flower orders, perhaps even to long-standing misappropriations." Mrs. Tulliver paled. "Never touched the accounts. I never would," she said fiercely. "Ask Mr. Greeley if you doubt me. He's the one who—" She stopped herself, lips clamping shut. "Mr. Greeley?" Miss Marple echoed gently. Mrs. Tulliver turned back to the flowers, her hands trembling. "I said enough." But Miss Marple, having planted her seed, knew it would grow. Later, at the post office, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Greeley himself, fumbling nervously with a parcel. "My cousin in York," he explained, laughing thinly, "sending some bits she asked for." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Such a thoughtful man. The village is lucky to have someone so organized. He blushed, clearly flustered. "Oh, I do what I can. You've overseen the parish accounts for many years, haven't you?" "Nearly 12, he said, pride warring with unease. "A heavy responsibility," Miss Marple said, "especially with all those restoration funds coming through after the storms 2 winters ago." He dropped the parcel. As he stooped to retrieve it, Miss Marple's voice remained casual. "I always marvel how one keeps track of it all. What with repair appeals, charity donations, fundraising. So easy for a slip to happen." When he straightened, his face was grey. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple." And he fled out the door, nearly knocking over a basket of knitting wool. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Mr. Greeley had something to hide, perhaps not murder, but certainly something worth fearing exposure over. And fear, Miss Marple knew, could make people desperate. That evening, Miss Marple found herself seated once again at Reverend Greenway's table, sipping carefully at a thin broth Mrs. Greenway insisted was good for the nerves. Across from her sat Harriet Blake. The vicar had invited a few parishioners for a quiet meal, hoping to lift spirits. It was not working. The conversation was stilted, the atmosphere heavy. It was Harriet who broke the silence, laying down her spoon. With a sigh, "I can't stand it," she said. "This waiting, this suspicion." "We all want answers," the vicar said gently. Harriet shook her head. "You don't understand. Beatrice wasn't just a busybody. She knew things that could ruin people." Miss Marple sipped her broth, listening. "Such as?" asked Mrs. Greenway. Harriet hesitated. Then, "Old debts, old grudges, even old scandals." Miss Marple set down her spoon. "Scandals?" she prompted, her tone mild. Harriet's hands twisted in her lap. "Years ago, there was trouble over the rectory funds. After Reverend Pritchard passed away. Money went missing. No one ever said so officially, but it was clear enough." Miss Marple nodded. "And Miss Hartnell knew?" "She hinted at it," Harriet said. "Not long before she died. She said she had proof now, something she hadn't had before." "What kind of proof?" Harriet shook her head. She didn't say, only that she wouldn't be silenced again. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Again, a word that suggested Beatrice had once tried to speak, and had been stopped. Back at the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. The pieces were aligning. Beatrice Hartnell had uncovered financial irregularities, both recent and old. She had intended to reveal them after the harvest fair. Someone with much to lose, had silenced her before she could. But who? Harriet Blake had motive, certainly, as did Mr. Greeley, even Mrs. Tulliver, though her guilt seemed more prideful than criminal. Yet Miss Marple felt sure the heart of the matter was older still, the missing funds from years ago, the discontent simmering beneath the harvest fair's cheerful bunting, and the yew tree, ancient, watchful, standing silent witness over it all. As Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, she allowed herself a brief smile. Tomorrow would bring the final tests, the small traps she would lay, not with accusations, but with observations. The truth, she was certain, was already trembling at the surface. It only needed the lightest touch to bring it crashing through. Because, in Lower Brambleton, as in all villages, secrets might sleep for years. But when they woke, they demanded payment day in full. Chapter 7. Another twist. The village awoke the next morning to an even heavier fog than before. It curled through the lanes and over the churchyard walls like a living thing, softening outlines, blurring familiar shapes. Miss Marple, stirring her. Porridge thoughtfully noted that fog always unsettled people. It made them uncertain. It made them careless. Today, she thought, would reveal something important. She simply hadn't anticipated how dramatically. The news broke mid-morning. It came via young Tommy Wills, breathless once more, this time skidding, into the post office with mud on his boots and terror in his eyes. "They've broken into the vestry," he cried. "The vicar's gone mad about it. There's papers everywhere." Within the hour, half the village had gathered outside the church. Inspector Cray was already at the scene, his face thunderous. Miss Marple, arriving quietly, saw that the vestry door hung askew on its hinges, the lock splintered. Inside, the place was a shambles. Hymnals scattered, collection plates overturned, filing cabinets pried open. But what drew Miss Marple's sharpest attention was the vicar's expression. Equal, parts fury and grief, as he stood over a small wooden box, its contents tipped onto the stone floor. A tangle of letters, receipts, ledgers, and among them the singed remnants of what had once been parish financial records. "Someone tried to burn them," Cray said grimly, showing her the blackened edges. "Was interrupted, fled before finishing the job." Miss Marple bent carefully and picked up a scorched sheet. The ink had run badly, but she could still make out 2 words before the charred line consumed them. Restoration Fund. Later, in the Daher vicarage drawing room, Cray addressed a grim-faced assembly of villagers. "This is now a criminal investigation," he said bluntly. "Burglary, destruction of evidence, possibly obstruction of justice." The vicar wrung his hands. "It's sacrilege," he whispered, "violating the house of God itself." Cray surveyed the assembled faces. Mrs. Tulliver, Mr. Greeley, Harriet, Blake, even Reverend Greenway's wife, pale and shaking. "All of you had access to this building," he said. "All of you knew the investigation was closing in." A murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple remained silent, watching. It was then that Harriet Blake, hands knotted in her lap, spoke up. "I didn't come to the Harvest Festival to sell jam," she said abruptly. "I came to find something." All eyes swung to her. "My husband, Dr. Blake, he kept a diary. Notes about everything he saw in the village, including things he shouldn't have seen." "What sort of things?" Cray demanded. Harriet hesitated, then said in a low voice, "Transactions between the old vicar, Reverend Pritchard, and several parishioners. Cash withdrawals from the Restoration Fund. Private debts paid. Discrepancies buried. There was a shocked gasp. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And you believe Miss Hartnell discovered this diary?" she asked quietly. Harriet nodded. She mentioned once, only once, that the ghosts of the rectory were more than superstition. "And you thought it might be hidden in the vestry?" Harriet flushed. "I didn't steal it. I looked, but I found nothing." Cray's jaw tightened. "Did Beatrice Hartnell confront anyone about this information?" "I don't know," Harriet whispered. "But I think she intended to." Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles lightly against her wrist, a habit she indulged when her mind moved faster than the conversation. If Harriet was telling the truth, and she seemed painfully earnest, then Beatrice Hartnell's death had nothing to do with recent disputes over hymns or flowers. It was about long-buried corruption, scandals hidden by time and silence, and someone who had everything to lose, had killed to keep it hidden. After the meeting, Miss Marple took a slow walk along Willow Lane. The fog was lifting now, revealing the damp autumn brilliance of the hedgerows. She paused by the churchyard, gazing at the yew tree. There, among the gnarled roots and tangled ivy, history slept, and secrets and guilt. She thought again of Mr. Greeley's flushed face, Mrs. Tulliver's brittle anger, Harriet Blake's hunted eyes. They were all connected, not by the present, but by the past, by choices made long ago, and the desperate measures taken to keep them buried. Back at the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple drafted a letter. It was short, polite, and carefully worded. It was addressed to Mr. Henry Pritchard, son of the late Reverend Pritchard, now a solicitor in Milchester. If anyone knew the truth about the missing funds and his father's quiet departure from Lower Brambleton all those years ago, it would be him. Miss Marple sealed the envelope with a dab of wax and handed it to the innkeeper to post. She felt certain now. The key to Beatrice Hartnell's death lay not in her actions, but in what she had uncovered. And someone, perhaps someone the village still trusted, had been willing to kill to ensure those old sins remained undisturbed. The next morning, her answer came swiftly. Mr. Pritchard's reply was brief but illuminating. Dear Miss Marple, there were indeed irregularities during my father's tenure. Monies from the Restoration Fund were loaned to several prominent parishioners under informal arrangements, none of it properly recorded. It was an open secret in certain circles, but my father believed exposing it publicly would destroy the parish. I recall 3 names often mentioned: Albert Greeley, Millicent Tulliver, and Jonathan Blake. Yours sincerely, Henry Pritchard, Miss. Marple folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her handbag. 3 names, 3 people still walking the lanes of Lower Brambleton. 3 people with very good reasons to fear Beatrice Hartnell's investigations, but only one had acted. Only one had been desperate or ruthless enough to silence her forever, and now, at last, Miss Marple knew who it was. All that remained was to prove it. And in Miss Marple's experience, the guilty were never more vulnerable than when they believed the worst was past. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke early. The mist was still heavy over Lower Brambleton, but she felt the clarity she had been waiting for. The pattern of human behaviour, as intricate and tangled as it had been, now lay clear before her. And, as always, the final move would not be made through direct accusation or confrontation. It would be made through observation, careful, quiet, inevitable. She selected her best black coat, donned a modest hat with a discreet veil, and made her way to the parish hall, where the Women's Guild had convened to discuss plans for a memorial service in Beatrice Hartnell's honour. Was, Miss Marple thought, almost poetic. The guilty never could resist paying tribute to their victims, especially if they believed it would conceal their own guilt. The parish hall was filled with the rustle of papers and the clink of teacups. Mrs. Tulliver presided at the front, attempting to maintain order as various members argued over hymn selections, flower arrangements, and the proper wording of the service bulletin. Mr. Greeley hovered near the refreshment table, offering anxious smiles. Harriet Blake sat stiffly at the edge of the gathering, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple made her rounds slowly, exchanging pleasantries, accepting a cup of tepid tea, and observing. She waited until the meeting had descended into predictable chaos before moving quietly to the centre of the room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. The conversations faltered. Every eye turned to her. "I thought," Miss Marple continued, "that before we decide on floral arrangements, it might be fitting to acknowledge a small but significant discovery." She opened her reticule and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. Not the letter from Mr. Pritchard, that remained safely tucked away, but a simple blank piece of foolscap, carefully aged with a little tea and curled at the edges. She held it delicately between her gloved fingers. "This," she said, "was found tucked behind the vestry filing cabinet. It seems Miss Hartnell hid it before she was taken from us." A ripple of tension coursed through the room. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I thought it only right to return it to the authorities. I'm sure Inspector Cray will want to examine it. After all, Beatrice hinted it contained names connected to irregularities in the parish's finances." She let the sentence hang. Weighted charged around the room, faces paled, hands tightened around teacups. And then, there it was. Movement, small, quick, almost invisible to anyone else. Mr. Greeley's hand jerked involuntarily toward his coat pocket, as if to shield something hidden there. A reflex, a guilty man's instinct. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her face remained serene. Not Mrs. Tulliver, not Harriet Blake, Albert Greeley, the treasurer, the man who had overseen the accounts for 12 years, the man whose debts had quietly grown while the church roof remained forever in need of repair. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered outside the parish hall, feigning a search through her handbag. Sure enough, Mr. Greeley emerged moments later, looking around furtively before striding briskly toward the lich gate. Miss Marple followed. At a discreet distance, he moved quickly, cutting across the green, past the duck pond, and toward the overgrown path that led to the old rectory ruins. A foolish place to flee, Miss Marple thought, and so very revealing. She found him standing by the crumbling stone wall, breathing heavily. In his hand, he clutched a small sheaf of charred papers he had clearly retrieved during the chaotic break-in at the vestry. He turned sharply at her approach, eyes wild. "Miss Marple!" he gasped. I didn't see you." "Clearly not," she said pleasantly. "You don't understand. I understand more than you think, Mr. Greeley." He sagged against the wall. "She was going to ruin me," he said hoarsely. "Over ancient history, over mistakes made decades ago." "Mistakes," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Or theft?" He glared at her. "I only took what was owed me. After everything I gave the church, all the hours, all the sacrifices, and they treated me like a servant." And so, when Beatrice Hartnell threatened to reveal the truth, "I didn't plan it," he cried. "I swear it. I only meant to frighten her, to reason with her under the yew tree before the festival." But she slipped, struck her head on a root. He broke off, trembling. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. At last she said quietly, "Accidents can happen. But leaving her there, stealing the letter, breaking into the vestry, those were no accidents. Greeley covered his face with his hands. "What else could I do?" he whispered. "You could have confessed," Miss Marple said softly. "You could have trusted that mercy still exists in some hearts." "But not in hers," he said bitterly. "Not in Beatrice's." Miss Marple sighed. "You may have been right about that, but you were wrong to believe that covering the past would save you." She turned away, leaving him to stare after her, defeated. At the end of the lane, Inspector Cray waited with Sergeant Webb. It was over. Later that evening, in the small lamplit sitting room of the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple sat quietly knitting, while the innkeeper's daughter read the news aloud from the Milchester Chronicle. "Local treasurer charged in parish scandal," she intoned. "Village mourns tragic loss of church organist." Miss Marple said nothing. The needles clicked gently in her hands. Outside, the autumn mist pressed against the window panes. Inside, all was warm and still. Justice had been served, not perfectly, perhaps, but enough, in the way of villages, in the way of human hearts. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following evening, under Reverend Greenway's steady guidance, a small gathering was held at the vicarage. Not a formal meeting, no declarations or accusations, but a quiet assembly of those most closely involved in the tragedy that had shaken Lower Brambleton. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting laid carefully in her lap, was at the heart of it all. Harriet Blake was there, pale but composed. Mrs. Tulliver sat stiffly upright, as though bracing for some unseen blow. Even Mr. Greeley was present under Inspector Cray's close watch, his face hollow with defeat. The others trickled in, Mrs. Canfield, Mr. Tulliver, a few members of the Women's Guild. Their expressions a blend of anxiety, curiosity, and dread. Once tea had been served, and once the rain tapping against the window panes filled the silences between heartbeats, Reverend Greenway addressed the room. "Miss Marple has graciously agreed to explain the sequence of events that led to our loss." His voice cracked slightly, and he sat down, head bowed. All eyes turned to the gentle figure in the armchair. Miss Marple smiled kindly, folded her hands and began. "It is important," she said, her voice soft but clear, "to remember that murder, if we may call it that, is seldom committed in isolation." She glanced at Mr. Greeley, who flinched. "It is usually the end of a long chain of fear, pride, desperation, and small dishonesties." A murmur swept through the room. "Beatrice Hartnell," Miss Marple continued, "was not killed simply because she was difficult or officious, though she could be both. She was killed because she uncovered a truth others had worked very hard to bury." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded letter. "This letter," she said, "is from Mr. Henry Pritchard, the son of Reverend Pritchard, who once presided over this parish. It confirms that years ago, funds from the Restoration Fund were misused, loaned informally, unrecorded to prominent parishioners." A hush fell. Mr. Greeley's head sagged lower. Miss Marple continued, unfaltering. 3 names were associated with that mismanagement. Mr. Greeley, Mrs. Tulliver's late husband, and Dr. Jonathan Blake, Harriet's husband. Harriet gasped quietly, but said nothing. "These loans," Miss Marple said, were never repaid properly. When Reverend Pritchard passed away, the scandal was quietly buried for the sake of the parish's reputation. She paused, but Beatrice, Hartnell, as meticulous in her records as she was in her choir sheets, stumbled across remnants of it. Recent irregularities, some minor, some not, led her back to the older ones. She held up a second item, the small scrap of cloth and button she had found beneath the yew. And when she intended to bring these facts to light after the harvest festival, someone panicked. Her eyes swept the room. Not Mrs. Tulliver, though she feared embarrassment. Not Harriet Blake, though she feared disgrace. No, it was Albert Greeley who had the most to lose. Inspector Cray shifted in his seat. Miss Marple's voice softened. He did not mean to kill her, that much is clear. But when he met Beatrice under the yew tree, whether to plead or to threaten I cannot say, she resisted. Perhaps she turned to walk away. Perhaps she threatened to expose him then and there. She folded her hands, but in the struggle Beatrice fell, struck her head against the gnarled roots. Whether death was immediate or not, Mr. Greeley left her there, arranged to make it look peaceful, and retrieved the incriminating letter she carried. She looked gently at Greeley. Guilt is a heavy burden, Mr. Greeley. It shows in the face, in the walk, in the hands. I have seen it too often not to recognize it. He bowed his head but said nothing. Miss Marple continued, addressing the room. But guilt alone is not proof. It was the break-in at the vestry that confirmed it. Whoever attempted to destroy the remaining financial records knew exactly what they sought. She smiled faintly. And it was during the meeting at the parish hall, when I produced a forged letter, that Mr. Greeley betrayed himself, reaching reflexively for his pocket. Gasps fluttered through the group. Miss Marple inclined. Her head, human nature, you see. It cannot be disguised for long. The silence that followed was heavy. At last Mrs. Tulliver spoke, her voice shaking. I suspected him, she said, long ago, but I thought it was harmless. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle. It rarely is, my dear. Harm, like guilt, grows if left untended. Harriet Blake sat rigid, her hands clenched. My husband's name, she whispered. It will be dragged through the mud again. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Perhaps. But remember, Mrs. Blake, what people remember is often not the scandal itself, but how one bears it. And you, I think, will bear it with dignity. Harriet's lips trembled, but she said nothing more. Inspector Cray stood. I'll be taking Mr. Greeley to Milchester tonight, he said heavily. There'll be a formal inquiry. Mr. Greeley rose unsteadily, led away by the inspector's firm grip. As the door closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale, a great shuddering release of breath. Later, as the villagers drifted away into the misty night, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire. Reverend Greenway knelt beside her, gratitude plain on his weary face. You've done more for this village than you know, Miss Marple, he said quietly. She smiled and shook her head. No, my dear Reverend, I've simply reminded everyone of what they already knew, deep down. He looked puzzled. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. In villages like ours, sin is never truly buried. It is simply forgotten, until someone, someday, happens to remember. And with that, she gathered her knitting bag and made her way into the darkening lanes. the mist curling around her slight figure. Behind her, Lower Brambleton stirred uneasily, beginning the slow, painful process of healing. Because that, too, Miss Marple knew was part of human nature, and human nature, for all its flaws, was endlessly, endlessly fascinating. Chapter 10. Aftermath In. The days following Albert Greeley's arrest, the village of Lower Brambleton settled back into itself with a weary, uneasy sigh. The harvest festival, once a symbol of community spirit, had been quietly cancelled. The fairground was dismantled, the bunting packed away without ceremony. The Women's Guild meetings became hushed affairs, their once cheerful debates about tea-urns and hymnals replaced by careful, guarded conversation. The Harvest Queen, a rosy-cheeked girl named Clara Mayfield, received her prize with awkward haste and no photographs. Life continued, as it always did, but something vital had shifted underfoot. The village, Miss Marple reflected, would never be quite the same again. Not because of the scandal itself, but because secrets, once unearthed, had a way of leaving the soil permanently disturbed. Inspector Cray, for his part, conducted his inquiries with brisk efficiency. Greeley, facing overwhelming evidence and his own broken conscience, confessed to everything. The decades-old financial misdeeds, the more recent loans taken from parish collections, and his fateful meeting with Beatrice Hartnell beneath the ancient yew. He insisted, and Miss Marple believed him, that he had not meant to kill her, but manslaughter, theft, and obstruction of justice were heavy charges nonetheless. Lower Brambleton's parish council resigned en masse within a fortnight. By Christmas, a new council had been elected, led by a stern but honest farmer named George. Merryweather and fresh accounting procedures were put in place. The Restoration Fund and the church roof would finally be properly cared for. One bright, cold morning, Miss Marple stood once more beneath the great yew tree. The grass had grown back, hiding the faint depression where Beatrice Hartnell had fallen. The church bells tolled overhead, solemn and sweet. Miss Marple traced the rough bark of the tree with a gloved hand, her thoughts reflective. It was not anger she felt, nor triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness. Beatrice Hartnell had been in many ways a difficult woman, rigid, unforgiving, obsessed with order and propriety. But she had also been brave enough to speak the truth, even when she must have known it would make her enemies. And in the end, her courage had cost her her life. Miss Marple bowed her head. In villages like this, courage was seldom rewarded, but it must still be honoured. Even quietly, even when no one else remembered. Later that afternoon at the vicarage, Reverend Greenway invited Miss Marple for tea. They sat by the fire, the rain tapping gently at the windows, the scent of cinnamon biscuits filling the air. "You saved us," he said simply. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Reverend, I merely listen." He smiled faintly. "You listened better than the rest of us ever thought to." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "It isn't about cleverness," she said softly. "It's about understanding that people, even the kindest, even the most respectable, are capable of terrible things when they are afraid." The vicar nodded slowly, and yet Miss Marple added. "They are also capable of redemption." She glanced toward the window, where the village green lay misty and golden in the late afternoon light. "Lower Brambleton will survive," she said. "It will recover. It always does." She sipped her tea, then set down the cup. "But it will carry the scar." The vicar looked at her, puzzled. "A scar?" Miss Marple smiled. "Of knowledge. Of remembering that beneath all the bunting and the flower shows and the harvest hymns, human nature runs just the same. Fearful, proud, foolish, brave." She rose, gathering her knitting bag. "And that, my dear Reverend, is what makes life so very interesting." As she walked back to the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Not at solving the case, but at knowing that, for all the secrets and betrayals, some small measure of justice had been served. Beatrice Hartnell's memory would not be honoured with grand speeches or stained-glass windows. But somewhere, deep beneath the roots of the old yew tree, the truth had been planted, and like all truths, it would grow, slowly, silently, inevitably. That night, as the church bells rang out across the misty lanes of Lower Brambleton, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles flashing in the lamplight. Outside, the village slept. Inside, she smiled to herself. Another case closed, another secret uncovered, another small reminder that even the quietest gardens could hide deadly thorns, and that, in the end, it was not the grand battles that mattered. It was the small victories, the silent triumphs, the quiet, steadfast insistence that truth, however painful, must always have its day.